morning again. Welcome. My name is Greg Satterthwaite. I'm assistant professor of jazz piano and African American Studies here at the University of Georgia. I'm excited to be presenting for you guys this morning on the topic of music, style of music which I love, called bebop. I'm going to talk about how bebop is both representative as evolution and revolution. I'm going to start with this quote by Dizzy Gillespie. It's taken me all my life to learn what not to play. I think that's a great introduction into my talk. It encapsulates the depth and the complexity of not only music, jazz music, but bebop music specifically. Music that is cerebral, complex, but yet earthy, soulful. It kind of has all the ingredients, and it definitely takes a lot of dedication and commitment to master. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, we will have defined bebop music and identified some stylistic features so you become more familiar with that. Examine the socio-political conditions and economic conditions that led to the development of bebop. Understand how the music is both representative as evolution and revolution, and become familiar with a few important people from the bebop era. This is a picture of the great Charlie Parker, and to his left is a young Miles Davis. Right behind the ear is probably 18 or 19. This is a musical innovation that developed in New York City, and in particular in Harlem at Min's Playhouse, Black-owned after-hours club. It's a style of jazz that would become the foundation of modern jazz. So much so that in our textbooks today, the innovations of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie undergirds what we teach students when it comes to improvisation. So these innovations have had a lasting, substantial effect. It's played by small combos, small instrumentation, as opposed to large ensemble or big swing band instrumentation. To get you oriented and get a better sense of bebop, we might start with swing, which is a style of music that preceded bebop. So in this clip, we're going to listen to the great Coleman Hawkins and then Charlie Parker. Coleman Hawkins is a figure who was central in the swing era. He played with Fletcher Henderson, which is a band who helped to craft the big band sound with their arrangers, Don Redman and Fletcher Henderson, instrumental in crafting what would be the big band sound. So he's part of that band. And interesting thing about Coleman Hawkins is he makes a landmark recording in 1939 of a tune called Body and Soul, which helps to kind of transition swing improvisation. It kind of serves as a catalyst for bebop improvisation, where he departs from melody, and a lot of his improvisation is based on arpeggiation, chord scales, extensions, passing chord tones. For non-musicians, more on that maybe later, or maybe less if you're already if it's going to know over you. But maybe the thing to note about swing music is this idea of melody, tunefulness, kind of tonality, something that's really catchable, really singable, versus bebop, which also has melody, but is a lot more complex, a lot more chromatic. And so we're going to hear that by the young Charlie Parker. One thing to note also is the amount of notes that are played. In the swing era, you're going to, not as many notes, focus on melody, longer notes, more space, and then you have Charlie Parker employing what's called double timing, where we're playing twice as many notes in the same space, which kind of implies a faster tempo. So listen for those things, and also watch Charlie Parker as Coleman Hawkins is solo, and he kind of looks over at him. Check out Pops. he's doing his best. You can interpret it how you may, but that's kind of how I saw it. Charlie Parker. I paused it just to listen to the last phrase. He's from Kansas City, and he always had the blues in his playing. So even though they're fast and complex and all this harmonic and innovation, in case you forgot, he still got the blues. Okay. All right, some more musical characteristics of bebop. And in that picture is a great Dizzy Gillespie, and that looks like Charlie Parker behind him at the Royal Roost in New York City in 1948. Okay, so a few features. First, this new style of drumming, which was pioneered by Kenny Clarke, and this term called dropping bombs, which is referring to the bass drum of kick drum playing unexpected accents, a reference to World War II at the time. So what Kenny Clarke did was in the swing era, we kind of had the kick drum playing on all four beats. And this kind of, big kind of bass sound and this steady beat. And what he found was he was trying to play a song one time in a swing era band. It was up tempo, and he couldn't play the kick drum that fast, so he transferred that rhythm to the ride cymbal, where now this cymbal becomes a primary timekeeper and the way that the beat is kind of displayed. And so he plays that swing beat with the ride cymbal, and now these other instruments like the kick drum and the snare drum become ways to accent and just kind of fill in the music and add all these kind of syncopated rhythms. So that was very revolutionary at the time. Kenny Clarke was kind of responsible for that. The bass player continues to play what's called a walking bass line. He's playing this kind of steady four-note pulse. Right, so that's a continuation of a musical feature from the swing era. So that's kind of just evolving. More complex chords and harmony. So we have what's called extended harmony, which is just using other extensions, upper extensions of the chords. So in layman's terms, maybe bigger chords and just more complex harmony. The music is technically demanding and the tempos are fast. And it's a way to not only challenge themselves, but also this music, like I mentioned before, was developed in clubs. And it was a way to kind of keep away musicians who weren't really serious about the craft of playing. So they would play at breakneck tempos, and so if you weren't a serious musician and weren't ready to play the song at a BPM of 280 or above, then you were going to have to go back home and practice. And they'd also like to change keys on you and call a song that you think you know, and then go up a half step, and then there you go. Then you're back home practicing. In this next clip, I want to play for you a snippet of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie playing a song called Hot House. Hot House is a contrafact, and what a contrafact is a new melody on a pre-existing chord progression. So musicians did this for copyright reasons or royalty reasons, so that they wouldn't have to pay another composer royalties. So much of bebop repertoire is contrafact based, where we're writing new melodies over old chord progressions. And this song in particular was based on Cole Porter's What Is This Thing Called Love? And Cole Porter is one of the most prolific songwriters of the jazz age, wrote for all types of mediums. In this clip, listen for, again, that fast kind of tempo. They played fairly up tempo. Lots of notes from Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. Listen for the drumming that we talked about, where you're going to hear the ride pattern on the cymbal, and you're going to hear that beat broken up by all these accents on the snare drum. And also listen for when, at the end of Charlie Parker's solo, when Dizzy Gillespie starts, he takes the last part of Charlie Parker's phrase and makes it the beginning of his new phrase. So that was another feature in bebop where they were really in tune and listening to each other melodically and trying to create, making sure they had continuity with what they played. Amazing. So by now you're thinking, wow, these guys are really great. They are creating some incredible new stuff. The reaction to this must be pretty positive. And surely their colleagues and their mentors are lauding them and congratulating them on their their innovations. Well, here's what Louis Armstrong had to say. All them weird chords, which don't mean nothing. You got no melody to remember, and no beat to dance to. Who is Louis Armstrong? He's one of the first great improvisers of jazz. He's born in New Orleans at the turn of the 20th century. He plays New Orleans small jazz and evolves that genre. And also is active in the 20s and 30s, playing with small groups and swing era bands. So really influential and important figure. I'm going to read a little bit from this text, A History of Jazz by Ted Gioia, and a little bit about what others were saying about bebop. An article in Collier's proclaimed, "You can't sing it, you can't dance it, maybe you can't even stand it. It's bebop." Time magazine, struggling to define bebop for its readers, explained that it was hot jazz overheated, with some overdone lyrics, full of bawdiness, references to narcotics, and double talk. Prominent musicians of the old school also chimed in with invective. Cab Calloway and others denounced modern jazz as Chinese music. Benny Goodman complained that modern jazz players were not real musicians, they were just faking it. As with anything new, there's always dissenters, right? There's supporters and there's non-supporters. So bebop was no different. Beboppers as outsiders in the jazz world. I want to read something else from you, which will help kind of provide some context for me looking at bebop as both evolution and revolution, and looking at these bebop players as outsiders. Bebop was defined by its social context as much as by the flats and sharps of its altered chords. Outsiders, even within the jazz world, the first generation of bebop players had the dubious distinction of belonging to an underclass within an underclass. Remember, this was a music this was a musical revolution made, first and foremost, by accompanists, not stars. Not by Benny Goodman, but by his guitarist, Charlie Christian. Not by Duke Ellington, but by his bassist, Jimmy Blanton. Not by Earl Hines, but his saxophonist, Charlie Parker. Not by Cab Calloway, but by his trumpeter, Dizzy Gillespie. Not by Coleman Hawkins, which we heard earlier, but by his pianist, Thelonious Monk. Not by Louis Armstrong, his colorful quote, but by his saxophonist, Dexter Gordon. Unfettered by the commercial pressures that beset the name band leaders of the day, these obscure practitioners of an unheralded art were free to pursue the extreme implications of this new sound. These less than famous players relished the opportunity to make a statement with their music, and the more difficult it was, all the better. I think that provides some context at looking at, these bebop innovators, and I want you to think about that cultural context as a way to kind of look at bebop as we kind of go forward. Beautiful picture of some bebop musicians and arrangers outside of Mintz Playhouse. So again, bebop was a result of economic changes in the music biz. It's a revolt against swing. It's an evolution of swing. And it's an expression of African American consciousness and pride. So during the swing era, black musicians couldn't get jobs with radio orchestras, or they couldn't get lengthy playing engagements at New York ballrooms. They're forced to tour the Jim Crow South, which was treacherous at best. Your life kind of hung in the balance. Bebop provided an outlet to explore outside of the status quo or the system. Right? And bebop represented a rejection of the status quo, in fact. Jazz musicians were not merely seen as entertainers. They did not want to be seen as just entertainers. I want to read one last thing from this text, which gives some context to this and the time that they're living in the 1940s. The individualism of the beboppers was fired further by their marginal status as black Americans at a critical juncture in U.S. history. In this last generation before the end of segregation and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, African Americans were intent on testing the limits as never before. The first generation of jazz players had succeeded as entertainers, and white America was content to celebrate them on that level. But the black jazz players of the 1940s wanted more. They demanded acceptance as artists, as esteemed practitioners of a serious musical form. Previously, only a rare individual, a Scott Joplin or Duke Ellington, aspired to these heights. But with the advent of bebop, a whole generation of black musicians was asserting itself as co-equals with the purveyors of highbrow culture, classical composers, the dramatists, the poets, the painters, and the sculptors. Another generation would pass before jazz musicians began attending music conservatories in large numbers. But already by the 1940s, the ethos would inspire such ambitions was already evident. So this is kind of important to consider, because next I'm going to get into representation. So knowing that, as we said before, all of these innovators are coming out of the swing eras. Their bosses are in the swing eras and kind of conducting themselves a certain way, having to entertain a certain way. And then now this break with bebop, not just musically, but artistically and socially, where we want to present ourselves in a different light. And so let's think about that as we kind of move forward. Black representation and culture. Here's a picture, a cover art to sheet music, a song, Jim Crow. And in the picture is Thomas D. Rice, a white performer who dressed in blackface and one of the most foremost performers of minstrelsy. And minstrelsy is the dominant form of entertainment in the United States in the 19th century for many years, a half a century. Kind of, dies down at the turn of the 20th century, but still, I argue that the effects, psychological effects of minstrelsy and how blacks can be represented in entertainment are very limited and stifling and affect performers as they continue to go forth. Performers like Louis Armstrong. So again, born in 1900, considered one of the creative geniuses, greatest creative geniuses ever. But he's born in 1900 and is coming out of minstrelsy. And again, these effects are still covering over Black America. There's limited roles, limited ways in which African Americans can be represented in culture. And say in the 1920s and 1930s, if you're in a movie, there's two roles. There's the waiter or the maid. And the way that you act and conduct yourself, has to be not as intelligent, right? Not as well spoken, but as dim-witted to kind of fit that mold of minstrelsy and all those kind of stereotypes that have been, created. I want to play a little bit of this clip. Again, Louis was criticized for his kind of onstage kind of demeanor. So we'll kind of see a little bit of how he kind of conducts himself and placates to the audience when he's performing. But then we'll also hear him improvise, which is brilliant and genius. And so for me, it's that juxtaposition of placating to the audience, fitting this mold, and then I pick up the trumpet and what's that? Just because my teeth are pretty, oh, just because I always make a smile. I like the treasure in the bed dollars. Just because I'm where I'm living, oh, take all my trouble, always smile. Just because my color shady makes me different. That's why it calls me shy. Great Louis Armstrong. We talked about Charlie Parker a little bit before, but I'm just going to quickly go through talking about a couple more instrumental favorites in bebop. So Charlie Parker is genius personified. And he really almost arrived, I think, at that place by his early 20s. There's a famous incident of him in his teens playing at a jam session on the bandstand, not sounding so good, and one of the elders, Papa Joe Jones, taking a cymbal and throwing it over at his feet, get him to stop playing. It worked. He stopped playing, and the myth of the story goes, he went home and practiced so much. I mean, these were voracious practices, 15-hour days. Kind of like John Coltrane, which we won't focus on today, but voraciously practiced, and emerged 4 or 5 years later, Charlie Parker. Again, he's part of some of those swing era bands, but virtuosic, incredible technique, this ability to double time, this ability to employ these upper extension harmonies and kind of look at improvisation in a way that has never been looked at before. And again, his genius has been documented and recorded, and it forms the basis of jazz improvisation pedagogy. And he's still revered and studied to today. He struggled with drug addiction, but it didn't seem to slow down his creativity. Dizzy Gillespie, we talked about him a little bit. Here's a picture with him with Chano Poza, which is a Cuban musician. And so Dizzy It's an incredible personality, and one of his, in addition to being one of the progenitors of bebop, he's one that's known for this new style, cubop, or this fusion of Cuban music and jazz music. And so he's written some incredible tunes that have become standards that's fusing jazz with Cuban or Latin music. He's born in Charlotte, South Carolina, and he's part of those musicians who are part of the Great Migration, moving from the south up to the north. Him, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, a whole host of other musicians. He has a long career. He's one of those musicians who doesn't use drugs, and I remember seeing him on the Cosby Show, sitting on the couch, and before he knew kind of what jazz was, and I was like, who's that guy? And his cheeks are out to here. So a long, influential, and beautiful career. Just to show you a little bit of Dizzy's personality, I just want to play a little bit of this clip with him talking about, and we'll just watch maybe about a minute and a half of it, of how he met Chino Pozo and developed this new style of jazz that fuses Latin with jazz.
I said, yeah. He said, Bible, bass. He said, he played. Now, this is the first time in jazz that the bass player wasn't playing boom, 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 boom. This is the first time. Because I haven't heard the bass, the ball bass player was like boom, 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 boom. So it's kind of said the bass player first, boom, 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 boom. And he said, saxophone, as he talked, trombone, trombone,
You can look for that clip later. Great Dizzy Gillespie, great personality, great persona. And also, little plug, Manteco Jazz Ensemble 2 will be playing that tomorrow in Ramsey as our closer. So if you want to hear some more jazz, you come to Ramsey Hall tomorrow at 5:30 for the Jazz Ensemble concert. Okay. Thelonious Monk. This is the house pianist at Min's Playhouse at in the early 1940s. I was, in preparation for this, was reading Dizzy Gillespie's autobiography, and he talks about this community of musicians, of black musicians, and this exchange of ideas. And he talks about him working with Monk. And Dizzy Gillespie played piano also, and would work out, practice a lot of things on piano. He talks about this communication, always showing Monk things, Monk showing him things, different chord voicings, this idea of this minor 6 chord, 6 in the bass, more kind of technical musical terms. But Monk is one of those players that was completely unique, out of the stride tradition, influenced by Duke Ellington, but even according to Dizzy, didn't seem affected by some of these other pianists and always seemed to kind of play like Monk. I guess a hallmark of a great jazz artist is individuality and being unique, and we're talking about creativity. This is one of the creative geniuses and one of the most prolific composers also, probably second to Duke Ellington, where many of his compositions have become jazz standards. Suffered from bipolar disorder, which affected him all his life, and he didn't play towards the end of his life. And just to give you, and we're wrapping up, just a few more slides, but just to give you a little bit of Monk's personality, I'm going to play this clip with him playing and dancing on stage. And maybe the thing to note about this that you might miss is that it looks like he's dancing and unaware of what's going on musically. You can see him kind of spinning around. But then at the end of the saxophone solo, you're going to see him quickly make a beeline to the piano he's going to play the end of the saxophonist's phrase, and that's going to become the beginning of his musical phrase. So, looks like he's not in tune, but he's in tune. Very unique sound, unique voicings and chords, lots of dissonance, lots of space within its voicings, and you know right away, just by the chord, that it's Thelonious Monk. That's how innovative and unique his approach is. Bud Powell, another great, incredible jazz pianist, really one of the first pianists to kind of put the bebop language that Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie was playing on the piano in the right hand. So incredible virtuosic musician. Also active in the 1940s, recording and playing with his musicians. Had a short career, sustained a head injury due to a racial incident, and suffered mental breakdowns and was in and out of institutions for that reason. But let's hear a little bit of the great Bud Powell. Towards the end of his career. As I'm listening to them, I'm thinking about Benny Goodman's statement that I read where he says they're just faking it. Oftentimes I have students who come in and at the beginning of jazz improv, they're kind of thinking, yeah, well, I just kind of get up there and, we're kind of in a key and we'll just kind of feel it, or I just kind of do whatever. And then, a few weeks in, they're like, oh, this is what it entails. Like, no, there is a lot of logic behind this. Everything that these guys are playing, when you write it out and you put it on paper, every note is accounted for. Now talk about genius. How the heck did they do that? Where you can look at every note and say, here's that chord tone, it's aligning on these beats, and they're always following this kind of system. In addition to making these beautiful melodies and playing with great rhythms, here they are making all this harmonic and logical sense and creating this new language that they all kind of learned and developed at the same time and just kind of came together and created this whole new kind of harmonic language that makes complete sense. No, they're not faking it. they're definitely not faking it. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up here. So, what did we learn today? Hopefully a few things. New to music. Bebop evolved from swing. Almost all bebop musicians played in swing bands. So that's certainly, the evolution part. They're building upon what their predecessors did, they're building upon that. But bebop musicians wanted great music that went beyond entertainment. And so these images and this way of placating to the audience and in the way that some of these older musicians did, like Louis Armstrong, they wanted nothing to do with that. Matter of fact, the great Wynton Marsalis, who loves Louis Armstrong, had a difficult time with Louis Armstrong at first because he just hated the way he kind of conducted himself on stage, that whole, kind of on stage antics. But, Wynton's born, Wynton's from a completely different generation and still living today. And, at the latter half of the 20th century, walking in somebody's shoes at the turn of it in 1900, where your life hung in the balance if you conducted yourself in a certain way or not in a certain way. Maybe we can understand, why certain behaviors existed. But in any case, that's a revolution aspect of your entertainers. They created a new image, a new harmonic language, which is just incredible. So I think I'm done. I think my time is up. I had a little bit of time for Q&A, but we might not have time for that. But if anybody has any questions or comments, we can do that now. No? Okay. Oh, one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, going off what Dr. Gary mentioned earlier about assimilating the culture and things, at least now America's doing more of an individualistic culture. I don't know what it is, but that's what I was thinking about. I know most of hip hop, it's that individuality and bringing your personality to it. It's kind of seen that maybe hip hop took from bebop and it's been talking about doing the showing and proving type thing, where it's like playing, more so than swing arts before. And I think that just they influence each other. That American culture isn't, as opposed to like community, more individualistic.
Well, I think it's both because I think you see the community, like even in hip hop, of people getting together, DJ Kool Herc, all these individuals who pioneered, the communities in that were in which that music was created, like where people are gathering, block parties, these different places, exchanging ideas. So there's that, just like men's playhouse, where we're getting together, we're showing each other things, there's a sense of community, but there's also that sense of individualism where you have to bring something to the table and be unique and kind of creative. Yeah. All right. I think I better stop so I have time to transition. Thank you, guys.
We can do one more. We'll be setting her up. Any other questions there, Mark?
I'm curious, as a practitioner, what are things that you notice in playing, like revisiting bebop compositions, maybe, just that you don't get just from the text and the stories of the music? What are things you notice as a player?
That's a good question. Well, I think the text does a good job of highlighting a lot of things that you're going to encounter. Like, this music is difficult. You have to understand harmony deeply. You're going to be challenged technically, and so there's a physical and the mental aspect of being able to think on your feet almost that fast. And there's a quote in Miles Davis from Disney's autobiography where he was like, shit was just going by so fast. It was like, so yeah, I think they do a good job of describing everything much of what you're going to encounter. I might have to think some more about what's unexpected.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.